If you are waiting for the Elation flagship in version 4.2, then I will be seeing you guys in the next early access. So with that out of the way, Ashveil brought me back to the good old days of Honkai style team building, where not everything was just the running the same path and watch things blow up. He encompasses a very similar design philosophy as Anaxa, being a sub-DPS with a strong potential of also being a main DPS. So far, all of the performances I've seen have been very satisfactory, and it's frankly a breath of fresh air after not playing flagship for such a long time, considering that ever since version 3.7, it's been either the Remembrance flagship, Break flagship upgrade, or the Elation flagship that's going to be taking place right now. Hey guys, MrPokke here, and as the rank 1 resident FEIXIAO believer, I have been looking forward to his arrival for a long time by now. So we take a look at Ashveil's kits, Eidolons, rotations, team comps, light cones, Sub-DPS, Hypercarry, etc. So without further ado, let's get into today's content. So in summary, Ashveil's kit is going to be weighted towards a sub-DPS due to his energy regeneration, skill point economy, 40% defense down, 40% crit damage buff, or 120% crit damage buff for full-up attacks. That said, his current best performing team at the moment is going to be a main DPS at similar cost investments due to a lack of a version 4 full-up attack DPS, unless you have a good enough FEIXIAO team back in version 2 in which he will drastically improve his performance over the old slot 2 like Topaz or even Cypher in a sustained team. His overall kit is very simple to understand and make use of, and there is a surprising amount of options that could see his sub-DPS role, like for example in Archer, or even potentially Caster as Death Trap for myself. So for its character's kit in casual terms, use your skill whenever possible, and use your ultimate to snipe the minions, letting the allies hit the bait targets for energy, rinse and repeat. For his basic attack, it's going to be mostly unused because his skill is going to cost you 0 skill points after the +1 skill point refund. But there might be some niche situations where you want to use your basic attack just for a little bit more skill points if you do not have enough energy, or if you're going to be using him with units such as Archer. For his skill, you will almost always use this not just for the 100% multiplier, toughness bar damage, but also for the additional 10 energy compared to his basic attack, as well as gaining 1 stack of gluttony, which I'll be explaining later. For most scenarios, skill point is not going to be an issue in either Hypercarry team comps or full-up attack teams, so feel free to use this as frequently as possible. Bait is going to be an application for Ashveil where it will be applied at all times, and as such, will apply a permanent 40% defense down buff, which scales extremely well with units like FEIXIAO's S1, Sunday's E1, or even Tribi's E4 due to defense down's exponential damage scaling. Also, just as a bonus, this defense down also applies in the subfield, like for example Spoxicle, but the bait itself cannot be applied in the subfield. So for example, if your Ashveil is in a prime field, then you are not going to be able to have bait in the subfield enemies. Likewise, if he's going to be in the subfield, then his allies cannot hit the subfield targets, which means that Spoxicle is going to be a more challenging matchup for Ashveil. Now moving on to his ultimate, I will explain a little bit more about the gluttony and charge in the talent portion, but for the ultimate itself, it is usually used as a massive single target burst damage, though it does come with a unique feature of pivoting your excess enhanced full-up attack damage to another target. Now keep in mind, this enhanced full-up attack damage is the one that consumes the gluttony, whereas the normal full-up attack from the talent builds gluttony, which is going to be 2 stacks. So ideally, you always try to hit at least 10 stacks of gluttony by ultimate for maximum damage using the enhanced full-up attack, because after you cast your ultimate, you also gain back 2 gluttony stacks for the full 12 stacks. That being established, you don't need to intentionally hold off its ultimate just for 10 stacks, as it will be inefficient for energy. Follow-up attack is going to be more important due to more ultimates, not the actual gluttony stack itself, so just something to keep in mind of. This ultimate is also what makes Ashveil so good, especially for a 100 single target DPS for himself, since his ability to clear mobs is going to be second to none, which is best shown in his combat against Nikado for the next MOC, easily dispatching the Lancers one by one to deal massive damage to Nikado before going all in. And like I mentioned, since the ultimate also has 2 stacks of gluttony to improve follow-up attack multipliers, this is going to be very nice when it comes to your overall rotations. While having a 150 energy cost ultimate might look very high, especially without running an energy regeneration rope, you actually have an extremely consistent 3-turn ultimate most of the time due to the 8 fixed energy from your talent, which cannot be affected by an energy regeneration rope. So in 3 turns, which is going to be 3 different skills for 90 energy plus a 5 energy cost from casting an ultimate, you only need about 7 different attacks from your party members, inclusive of your summons and follow-up attacks, to maintain 3-turn ultimate. And this is not including if Ashveil gets a kill or he gets hit from the enemy enemy targets. It is ironically also going to be a potential DPS loss if you out too early before clearing off your charges, as you might not have fully consumed the follow-up attack charges, which could be possible running a Hypercarry Ashveil with energy regeneration sources like Sunday or even Huo. Now moving on to the talent, two main things over here. Gluttony is going to be different from your charge stacks. So Gluttony is going to be this separate stack at the bottom left hand corner that stacks all the way up to 12 at E0, 18 for E2. The charge stacks are the 3 different dots on Ashveil's portrait, and for every single charge is going to be equivalent to 1 follow-up attack. And every single enhanced follow-up attack during your ultimate will consume 4 stacks of Gluttony to improve its damage multiplier. So Gluttony itself is going to be obtained via either your skill, follow-up attack, and ultimate at 1, 2, and 2 stacks respectively, while the charge is simply letting go of 1 follow-up attack, which is going to be his talent per charge. Killing a target via his follow-up attack also gains 1 stack of Gluttony, which means ideally you use your ultimates on mobs to land multi-kills and start stacking Gluttony for your next ultimate's enhanced follow-up attack. The A energy is also going to be fixed, so there's no point running an energy regeneration rope as you will lose too much damage from the lack of attack percentage. Now the multipliers for the follow-up attack itself is actually going to be really low at only 200%, but the main purpose for a sub-DPS Ashveil is to generate stacks and energy for the team using said follow-up attacks, such as for example your FEIXIAO stacks, your Robin energy, and your Tribute energy. Though main DPS Ashveil can still do considerable damage even with a 200% multiplier, because number 1, enhanced follow-up attack is where the big damage is going to be, and number 2, just simply running a standard Hypercarry like with Sunday and Tribute will still give you a lot of damage amplification. Then moving on to the technique, just use it and you get a charge. Yippee! Now jumping into the major traces, Gluttony stack generation, which is going to be explained earlier, you will try to kill units with your Ashveil's follow-up attacks for more stacks and use your skill whenever possible, hitting 10 stacks before ultimate ideally, but if you can't hit it, then it's going to be fine. Now why 10 stacks is going to be, as mentioned, ultimate itself gives you 2 stacks, which is going to be a total of 12 max, and after you cast your ultimate, casting 1 more enhanced follow-up attack, it actually refunds you back 2 more additional Gluttony, which is going to be a little bit easier to hit 10 Gluttony for your next ultimate again. The second trait is going to be additional damage for a follow-up attack based on your Gluttony stacks as well, up to 120% additional damage. It is a decent increase, but the base multiplier is still going to be a little bit low. And then lastly is going to be a massive 40% crit damage buff to all allies and 120% crit damage buff to your follow-up attacks. Now this combined with 40% defense down, skill point economy, and energy regeneration is what makes Ashveil a strong sub-DPS. And then for his minor traits, it's going to be 14% lightning damage, 10% attack as well as 37% crit damage, which is going to be very, very nice. Then when it comes to skill leveling priority, it's going to be skill and ultimate, followed by your talent, followed by your basic. You will want to level up everything, but you could leave a couple of points for your basic. Skill is going to be for your defense down, as well as ultimate for the enhanced follow-up attack damage multipliers. Agile normal follow-up attack multiplier is going to be not as important, but it's good to raise them nonetheless. Now moving on to the light cone portion, for signature light cone, TLDR is going to be 18% crit rate, 40% attack, as well as a vulnerability of 20% unstackable. So this light cone is pretty nice, but we do have very decent alternative options, especially if you put Topaz back then and got her S1, or getting 1 copy from the light cone shop, which acts as a very decent substitute. Topaz light cone itself going to be having an 18% crit rate, which is the exact same as a signature light cone, 30% personal follow-up attack damage, as well as an up to 24% crit damage buff for all allies as long as the target has 2 stacks of team. But remember, you do need to hit a target at least twice first to get a 24% crit damage buff. This is going to be slightly lower than 20% vulnerability, which is also going to be applied a little bit easier, but nonetheless a good option to have, especially if you really have 1 copy or more of Topaz light cone, because this is going to be stackable. Otherwise, the Daughter Ratio light cone, Battle Pass light cone still at the end, or even Herda Store Cruise and Stellar Sea can also be considered. So here is going to be the damage comparison between your signature light cone, Topaz S1, and I also did a little bit of bonus for Topaz S5 light cone. So generally, as you can see over here, it's going to be around a 15% damage difference between S1 as well as Topaz S1, which is very, very close for a sub-DPS damage amplification since it's within a 20% damage gap. Though it's comparison between 2 different limited light cones, not a limited light cone and a free light cone. Personally speaking, players who already have a Topaz light cone and don't mind saving the cost for E1 or E2 vertical investment can skip the S1, while those who are running Cruising and Stellar Sea or other 4-star light cones can consider getting this S1 instead. As a bonus, I also tested a S5 Topaz light cone for the whales or light spenders who are thinking of going all in S5 Topaz using the light cone redeem shop. it is only going to be a roughly 3 to 5% damage increase depending on the FEIXIAO ultimate or the Ashveil follow-up attacks. Ashveil follow-up attacks might have been slightly higher if I change the Relics to account for extra crit rate, which means you can get more crit damage, but generally I would not recommend redeeming for an S5 Topaz Lycon. Personally, if you really want to ask my opinion on what to redeem for an S5, I would just go to run main, but that's just going to be me. Aside from that, I also would not use this Lycon for main DPS like FEIXIAO herself, sticking to her own S1 or daughter ratio S1 for the highest possible damage amplification. At this point, Ashveil is going to be the only one that can make use of this the most, unless you intend to skip him and get his Lycon from Mosaic or Topaz, which could also be considered. But generally speaking, he is going to be a considerable upgrade over them for FEIXIAO follow-up attack teams. Now there is one little bonus, and that is gonna be his Lycon given to Archer, because it technically does give you 18% crit rate as well as the ability to launch a follow-up attack, which Archer actually has, having 40% attack as well as a 20% vulnerability. So if you're gonna run an Archer with Cruise and Stacy, you could consider thinking about this to give it to your Archer instead. Now moving on to the Relics portion, it's gonna be a classic two main options, your follow-up Grand Duke or the Elitist 4-piece Eagle. You could also consider running the debuff set if you do not have a good Grand Duke set. So generally speaking, for most players, your Grand Duke is gonna be your best in slot, because for Ashveil, you can make use of the full effect of the set bonus because his follow-up deck does have multi-hit, as you can see from this picture right here. I would use this over the Valerius 4-piece, as his ultimate damage is only going to be a 400% multiplier, which is considerably lower than his follow-up attack frequency. You can also consider the debuff set from Akron if you have very good subsets, since most players probably found for the Diver back in Panic Cutting 4-piece, especially if you skip out on Duke or DOT if you're not a DOT or follow-up attack player. Now the effect itself for Grand Duke is actually alright, but I am going to be hoping for a newer 4-piece in the follow-up attack teams in the future that can stack either defense down or vulnerability on a follow-up attack DPS, since Grand Duke is heavily outdated compared to a newer 4-piece options we have ever since version 2 or even version 3. Lastly, Eagle 4-piece could be considered for a pseudo 200 speed running a 167 speed Ashveil while still maintaining good crit rate as well as crit damage, but I will highly not recommend this for players because the speed breakpoint is going to be very high, especially without DDD or external speed buffs. Then moving on to the 2-piece, the brand new follow-up attack set City of Converging Stars is going to be the best in slot. Definitely a very good option for Ashveil because it also acts like a pseudo support in Sub-DPS 2-piece, which will most likely be his role, especially when a stronger follow-up attack DPS releases in the future to use Ashveil as a Sub-DPS with. Otherwise, 2-piece Durant is still going to be a good option, especially with the stronger subsets, which is going to be a minimal difference. You're comparing 25% attack and crit damage versus 24% attack and team-wide 12% crit damage. Now note that for your main DPS Ashveil, Durant is probably going to be slightly better for his personal damage, since units like Robin and DHPT will not care about a 12% crit damage buff, although Sunday and Triby could see some slight benefits, for example, higher crit damage buff from Sunday, as well as more Triby follow-up attack DPS. Then running to his main stats or subsets, his body is always going to be a crit rate, feet is going to be speed or attack boots, plan are going to be lining or attack percentage, and rope is always going to be attack percentage, with priority on crit rate as well as speed subs. The crit rate is going to be a self-explanatory body with no good crit subsets in Ashveil's tracers, and you always want to have crit for a DPS. For your boots, attack is going to be if you're going to be running him with Sparkle for a low speed Ashveil at high speed Sparkle, otherwise you will be running speed boots with Sunday for a 134 setup. Or you could also consider running attack boots with high speed subs in general, especially if you want to run him with FEIXIAO and Robin to hit a 134 speed while having the additional buffs from Robin's action value advance. Lightning Sphere or attack is going to be a minimal difference, though attack can be more universal for future DPS, and you always run attack percentage rope as the energy regeneration does not affect the 8 fixed energy and you lose way too much damage. Now moving on to the Eidolons, and the first of which is gonna be his Eidolon 1, basically a 24% vulnerability up to 36% at 50% or lower. So purely from the stats alone, it's gonna be a pretty decent damage increase, comparable to E1 Robin or perhaps even E1 Triby, especially for sub 50%. Though I would want to keep in mind, I would say E1 Triby is still gonna be way better because of the AoE value of the smart targeting to condense your unit's excess damage into the main target itself. So E1 Triby is just gonna be a different beast. But otherwise, I would say that this is gonna be not too shabby, though considering the amount of vulnerability sources we have nowadays, it is not super rare to get vulnerability from other things, so nothing too crazy for E1 but decent enough value. Then for E2, it allows your Gluttony to stack on for 12 to 18, and you get back 6 Gluttony after your ultimate, so you can stack on Gluttony as usual compared to E0. Purely from a damage increase, this will allow your enhanced follow-up attack to have one more stack of 200% multiplier increase, as well as the damage from the traits going from 120% to 180%. Considering the old enhanced follow-up attack cap is going to be 600% at 12 stacks, this will be a more than 25% final damage increase alongside with your damage buffs, likely closer to 35 or 40% damage increase depending on how much damage percentage sources there are. Now, whether you're going to be running a main DPS or sub-DPS Ashveil, both of them do see pretty decent damage increase due to his frequent follow-up attacks from his ultimate. Then for his Evo, it's going to be, oh my god, insane 40% debuff, right? Pretty much permanent, so that's going to be that. And then for the E6, it's going to be a classic 20% res pen, though the second line does have a very big damage buff going up to 120% just to make him deal even more damage. So between E1 or S1, I would get E1 just for a higher damage increase, especially if you own an S1 Topaz already, or you want to exchange a S1 Topaz from the Litecoin shop. Otherwise, E0 Ashveil is honestly completely fine, and you can save your cost for units like E2 FEIXIAO or future follow-up attack main DPSs, which may or may not have a stronger E1 and E2s, such as E2 Castrus, E2 Final, as well as E2 Evernight. Now, finally moving on to one of the most important topics, and that is going to be his team comps. So for Ashveil specifically, the biggest question is ultimately the difference between a Hypercarry or a Sub-DPS Ashveil. And I've actually tested this multiple times from different setups for both variants, but to keep this video a little bit shorter, we will just be talking about the best in slot for both teams, and that's going to be Tribby Sunday versus FEIXIAO Robin, both of them running a DHP team. So for the Hypercarry setup, I've tested variations between your Sunday with Speed Boots Ashveil, Sparkle with Attack Boots Ashveil, E1 Tribby versus E1 Robin, but spoiler alert, E1 Tribby was way better to maintain your ultimate uptime compared to Robin, and a 1-cost team performance with Ashveil running a E0 Ashveil Sparkle, E6 RMC with E0 Litecoin, as well as a E0 Ashveil DHPD. Now, a little bit more explanation for the 0-cost team, or technically 1-cost since Ashveil is going to be 1-cost. We have Sparkle from the free choice from the selector, RMC for free from the story, and giving ample damage amplification for any crit DPS, and DHPT being a free universal sustain. This naturally ended up being our 0-cost choice, with Cruising the Status C for Ashveil, DDD for Sparkle, Story Mimi Litecoin, as well as any high attack Litecoin for DHPT respectively. Now, I tried this out against MOC Nigador as well as MOC Sparksy, but keep in mind that for Sparksy, this performance is not ideal even for higher cost Ashveil teams due to Subfield's anti-synergy with bait, because your targets cannot hit the bait target, and if Ashveil is going to be on the prime field, then your main DPS cannot hit bait for Ashveil to generate energy. Though this team was still able to kill Nigador at 3 cycles due to the environment as well as enemy team target. Now, I would say this is going to be a temporary team, more so to test if you want to commit into Ashveil during a shield environment, then decide if you want to commit more cost for him in the future. For more upgrades to a free-to-play, consider getting a signature Litecoin first, followed by either more follow-up DPS in the future to make him a sub-DPS, or hyper invest into E2 Ashveil while keeping RMC and Sparkle for the best cost usage. For the sub-DPS, aside from FEIXIAO, I've also tried using Ashveil with Archer and Castrus, both at E0 as well as an E2 FEIXIAO, in which I'll be making a separate video because I just really like this unit. And then note, for your DHPD sustain, there might be an argument for using Huo post-Nova Flare due to the energy uptime, especially if you are not going to be using him with FEIXIAO, or if in the future follow-up DPS also wants to use energy. We will be having more tests with Ashveil on the live server, so look forward to the live demonstration. So the team specifically today is just going to be Sunday Tribby as well as FEIXIAO Robin, or E0 S1 except for the E1 S1 Tribby versus the E1 S1 Robin. So you can see from this performance over here for your Hypercarry, Sunday gives us the best synergy due to energy gain as well as extra turns, which can drastically improve Ashveil's ultimate uptime, making use of Tribby and DHPD to quickly let go of his charges to gain the highest possible damage while stacking Gluttony for the next ultimate. Sparkle can also work, but Ashveil can't really make use of the additional skill point as well compared to Archer, and Robin has a very hard time keeping up her ultimate with only Ashveil as the main DPS. DHPD is the default sustain any option unless you're thinking of a sustainer's run, especially once you run him alongside Sunday. For Cypher, she might have a potential due to her own follow-up attack, defense down stacking from S1, as well as Patron's decks. I will test her in a live server because I think most of y'all probably skip Cypher. So the elephant in the room at this point, yes, as of the current version 4.1, Hypercarry Ashveil deals more total damage as an entire team compared to a sub-DPS Ashveil with FEIXIAO, assuming all at similar cost investments. But one thing to note is that your Hypercarry Ashveil is very susceptible to enemies, especially for example Sparksicle. For Sparksicle, his bait cannot be hit by your allies on the prime field, less the DHPD Dragon, and this is largely due to FEIXIAO's multipliers unable to match up with Ashveil's personal damage amplification with Sunday and E1 Tribby. However, this changes once more investment gets introduced, such as the value of an E2 FEIXIAO versus E1 Sunday and E1 Tribby, which we'll be discussing a little bit later. So I play this team, which is Hypercarry, extensively on all 3 endgame content, but generally speaking, the benefit of a Hypercarry against an enemy like Nikador is going to be the ability to deal with the spears much more easily because of the pivot targeting, which is something that FEIXIAO herself is going to be struggling against the Lancers. If FEIXIAO focuses on the Lance, then E0 FEIXIAO can't get enough stacks with Ashveil and DHPD alone while losing out on war armor damage. And if FEIXIAO focuses on Nikador, we are losing a lot of damage on the table due to the Lancers constituting about 12.5% of Nikador's max HP. On the flip side, Hypercarry Ashveil struggles a lot more against bosses like Sparksicle, in which FEIXIAO can bring up the gap to a much closer distance as FEIXIAO excels in burst damage in the subfield without relying on the bait. But that being said, not having the bait in the subfield is still going to be a little bit bad because we cannot get energy for Ashveil. Now for the sub-DPS, FEIXIAO is definitely going to be the most synergistic due to Flying Aura stacking with Ashveil's insane frequency of follow-up attacks, basically a better Mose in every sense of the word. Defense down also scales perfectly with FEIXIAO's S1, which is going to be a 94% defense down, close to 100%. You could even consider running Quantum 4-piece just for the last 6%, but I prefer Valerius or Eagle 4-piece for E2 FEIXIAO. For the previous follow-up attack team in FEIXIAO, which is going to be Topaz, while Topaz might have 50% follow-up attack vulnerability, it is single target and it requires Topaz skill to swap targets, which has been the biggest problem with Topaz ever since she launched, especially when it comes to pivoting between different targets. Cypher was also pretty decent, but the follow-up attack frequency pales in comparison for Ashveil, which drives FEIXIAO much faster. Aside from FEIXIAO, Archer does have a surprisingly decent performance as his follow-up attack will always land on the same target with Ashveil's follow-up attack, generating very good skill points, and in some scenarios, such as for single target scenarios, I can see Ashveil potentially even outperforming Tribi at E0 due to the 40% defense down, which scales extremely well with quantum DPS like Archer and E2 Sparkle. The only concern for Ashveil is that he's ultimately going to be skill point neutral, while Tribi is going to be skill point positive, which may be a little bit tight for non-E1 Archer havers, but overall a decent enough performance. Now, I also tried this just for fun, which is going to be a Castoris, Avalanche, and Hyacinth for those players who skipped Cyrene, and it was also not too bad considering that it was a very decent 3-cycle on Sparksicle despite being an anti-remembrance boss. Now, the raw 40% defense down, crit damage buff, and its own damage multipliers did fairly well despite Cyrene being a definitive upgrade. So generally speaking, it might be a considerable investment for remembrance mains who missed Cyrene, and you also are thinking of pivoting into a follow-up attack team by skipping the Elation flagship in version 4. So ultimately, from a raw DPS perspective, Hypercarry Ashveil is going to be better for now, but in the future, either with a better follow-up attack main DPS or a FEIXIAO Nova Flare, this can change extremely quickly and pivots Ashveil's role from a main DPS to a sub-DPS, so something to prepare for if you decide to pull Ashveil right now. Now moving on to the final topic, and that's gonna be our endgame performance. For this video, I will focus purely on Hypercarry Ashveil since more players will likely own Sunday and Tribi compared to FEIXIAO, so it is what it is. But a dedicated video with a sub-DPS Ashveil on E2 FEIXIAO is gonna be coming very soon. Now, extremely important for your endgame performance is that your manual and auto performance is differs by quite a bit, especially if you want to compare with like Elation flagship, Remembrance flagship, or even Break flagship. It doesn't really matter if you're going to be running a Hypercarry or sub-DPS Ashveil due to the selection of your bait as well as energy management, so it's highly recommended for Ashveil players to manually do your endgame content. So here are going to be the performance you can see right here. So starting off with Memory of Chaos, the buff over here is going to be pretty beneficial for the additional number of instances of attack, so definitely a shield environment for Ashveil himself, and on top of that, Nikador is going to be a perfect enemy for Ashveil. Now for Ashveil Hypercarry, it will mainly depend on how frequently can he make use of the ultimate enhanced follow-up attack for maximum gluttony stacks, especially by killing the enemy target mobs. So in the case of Nikador, it was the perfect fight for Ashveil as the spears gave him an incredible damage output of 12.5% of Nikador's max HP, and he did not face the issue of changing targets frequently since his ultimate enhanced follow attack was built exactly for scenarios like Nikador's spear. War Armor as a gimmick is also perfect for follow-up attacks and high-frequency attackers such as Ashveil himself, as well as Tribi and DHPD. For the second half against Kafka, aside from a whopping 40% lightning rest, which is going to be making it much worse, his performance was still not too bad coming in at 3 cycles, with a focus on the Horse Elites first so as to then focus on Kafka. I would consider actually using Huo over here just for the cleanse from the mind control, which lost us quite a bit of damage, on top of the energy regeneration from himself as well as Sunday. If ending, this fight will show a clearer picture for Ashveil in a less shield environment for Nikador and the new MOC buff. Then moving on to Pure Fission, surprisingly as a Han unit, he was able to full auto 40k Pure Fission, albeit just barely. Now this is definitely also due to the Pure Fission buff, which gave a lot more damage and grid, so take this performance with a huge grain of salt. That being said, the gimmick for Ashveil in Pure Vision is you do not aim the boss, but rather use his ultimate to continuously focus on the mobs, each defeat giving him more gluttony stacks as well as 3% max HP damage to the boss itself. Now, since his enhanced follow-up attack can bounce between targets, this was much more efficient, which is one of the first time Han units can focus on minions without losing too much damage. Again, the AI cannot prioritize the minions over the boss, so I wouldn't be surprised with a double 40k and a much better clear time despite being a Han hypercarry for Ashveil. Then lastly, for Epoch Shadows, I would say this is probably going to be Ashveil's best performance, not because of Negador, because he was built perfectly for Negador with the fight and the gimmicks involved, but also because he can clear FEIXIAO with an extremely similar score despite her side having no follow-up attack buffs aside from the 30% crit damage on completely auto gameplay. Now beware, manual will play a huge role in Negador because the AI will not make use of the enhanced follow-up attack and ultimate to target the spears, which will greatly reduce the clear speed by roughly 200 AV. Same thing for FEIXIAO because he cannot change to a new target and deal the lightning weakness and break all 3 different parts, but despite that, we still got a 3-6-2-5 clear on the FEIXIAO half. So in summary, for his endgame performance, I was pretty satisfied for him as a main DPS, around the same caliber as a next up when he first launched, and I'll be looking forward to see how my E2 FEIXIAO team will pop off in a live server after getting broke. And with that, we've pretty much come to the end of our entire content today. And our final thoughts, I would say that Ashveil is going to be a very fun unit to use, especially for myself, because I really like playing FEIXIAO anyways. So take my opinion with a little bit of a salt, as I'm definitely going to be pulling for him. That being said, if you are logged in for Remembrance flagship or Elation flagship or Super Break flagship, and you have enough teams lying around and you do not have any desire to play full up DPS, then the balance in 4x2 will definitely be much more suitable for you. You can also consider pulling for Ashveil if you're going to be interested in trying out follow-up attack DPS as a team comp, building him as a main DPS first with the leftover Sunday and Tribby and Sparkle from your older teams which you cannot make use of, then pivot Ashveil into a sub-DPS once a future main DPS arises. So with that, we'll come to the end of today's content. Let me know what you guys think, thoughts and comments down below. Word of the day is going to be wife support. Join Discord, use code POKE for 10% off gamer subs. All the best with gacha pools, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.